What do you do after your opponent plays d4? This is personally one of my least favorite openings to play against. I find it to be so difficult. A lot of the times your pieces are suffocated and you don't get that fun game that you're looking for. Today, I am going to show you my three best openings that you can play against d4, and I'm going to use famous examples from world champion grandmaster chess players. My name is Anthony Arena. I am a 2000 rated chess expert from Long Island, New York. Let's get started. First game we're going to look at is by one Mikhail Botnik, the ninth world champion. And in this position, he is going to choose to go for the Queen's Gambit decline. So the whole point of playing d5 is simple. Your opponent is trying to take the center, and you are going to challenge the center back and say, well, okay, if you're going to take the center, I'm there with you. Now, a lot of times your opponent would love to play e4. In this case, it would be the Blackmore Gambit, and that is not the best response. c4 is the classical response. You will see more often than not. I highly recommend not taking here because that gives your opponent exactly what he's looking for. After e4, this bishop is going to win that pawn back, and your opponent has complete control of the center. This is a proven better position for white. Instead, I highly recommend playing either e6 or c6. In this case, the Queen's Gambit decline, which is the first opening we're going to look at. If pawn takes pawn, we take back, and we have a really good game where both our bishops, knights, are ready to go, and we're going to castle quickly. So instead, he builds up the pressure, and Botvinnik really has two good options here, either playing knight f6 or c6. c6 transposes into the semi-Slav, and of course, if takes, you're going to take back, and you're completely fine. But here, a steady development of all the pieces in the position and the crucial pin. This is something that you really need to understand, and that while this pin is very dangerous, you're not necessarily terrified of it. You still have your bishop here that can go to e7, and you can still push h6 and g5. In this case scenario, Botvinnik actually ignores the threat entirely and takes. Now, while I did say that a lot of times you can't take on c4, in this particular position you can. And the whole reason behind that is after e4, Botvinnik decides to play b5. Now, if you're not a chess expert or world champion, I highly recommend not taking this pawn and not playing this type of position because more often than not, you will be trapped. So this is more of an exception, but I do think it's very interesting to look at. Here, e5 is played. I'm sure many of you were screaming at the board saying, wow, wait, e5. And yes, this is a problem. However, Botvinnik had an amazing idea. He knew his opponent was going to castle since the queen side was very, very disastrous. You were not going to be able to castle queen side, so king side instead, right? And here he decides to play h6. If pawn takes, and actually queen takes back or pawn takes pawn, bishop g7, and Botvinnik has a really nice position. He's essentially blowing up his king side because he's going to plan a pawn storm later on. Here, we're going to go knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, which is the best line, by the way, because this knight still cannot move. Otherwise, we lose the queen. So knight to d7. And here we do have adequate defense, pawn takes, and then bishop b7. You probably guess what's going to happen next, but Botvinnik is going to put a lot of pressure on the king side. The queen side is not really an option. It's not going to be safe. And you're going to see a c5 push, and you're going to see a really nice bishop pair and open rooks. Still, our opponent, he's not too worried. He thinks that he can get away with the castle. But here's a problem. Queen c7 is coming, c5 is coming, even the bishop is coming in for a nice attack. A long castle, two rooks. It's really going to be quite dangerous here, especially after Botvinnik plays the best move. So pawn a4. Now, you might ask yourself, why pawn a4 as opposed to maybe continuing to defend the weak king side? And it's really quite simple. Sometimes the best defense is actually offense. When you are playing an opposite castled game, notice the king is on the king side, the king here is on the queen side, it is best to attack your opponent's king to play a very quick, rapid, and aggressive game. The fastest player will win these positions. But here, not even rushing queen to c7, but a very calm b4, pushing the knight away and stealing a tempo. And the whole idea was to push c5. discover attack on the knight, and that bishop finally handy. And notice that he will be eyeing down g2 after the knight moves. So queen 2 b1, defending the knight on e4. Okay. Here in this situation, queen to c7, you have to move the knight now to avoid checkmate. And here we're going to go ahead and control the pace of the game. These pawns are going to push c3, so the bishop takes. And I want you to note here that a very classy defense by Botvinnik, not going and taking the bishop, because of course the rook slides over to c1, and all of a sudden you've lost your queen, so you can't do that. Instead, he's going to play queen c6. These one move checkmates aren't designed to win the game on the spot. Keep in mind that yes, he is the world champion, but he is playing a grandmaster, the top 0.0001% of chess players. So he's not going for the mate, but he's trying to weaken the structure and get his bishop on c5. And this is how you play multiple moves in conjunction to create an attack. So d3, the queen is going to move over in order to defend the bishop. And here in this situation, we play bishop c5. The whole idea is simple. At some point, you're going to be able to involve your queen and bishop on this diagonal in order to protect the threats. But Botvinnik has an absolutely insane, sensational finish to this game, and it starts off with queen d6. Now, in this situation, the idea is simple. He's going to sacrifice a rook on h2. The bishop is going to block the g1 square, and he's going to move this other rook over to h8 and use the queen in conjunction with these pieces to checkmate his opponent. If something like bishop f4, which seems very natural, rook takes, king takes, and rook check. And in this situation, you're actually looking at mate a lot faster. So in this situation, instead, he's going to defend with his queen. But here, we still can sacrifice on h2. Takes. Notice here, if bishop on h6 defends, we can play queen takes queen. The bishop can't take back. So in other words, the queen is undefended. So instead, queen h4, and we just win the queen and the game. King's going to have to go to h3 in order to avoid mate. Now we're going to look at the second option against d4 by one Bobby Fischer, maybe the best chess player of all time. After d4, we see knight f6. The first option we explored, the queen's gambit declined, focus on controlling the center and fighting against your opponent in the center squares. In this situation, Bobby Fischer is playing the king's Indian, where he's actually ignoring the threat to the center. He's saying, I'll get that back later. For now, I'm going to focus on developing my dark squared bishop to g7 and castling quickly and effectively. And basically, within 4 moves, you're going to have your bishop on g7, and by move 5, you'll castle short, and you're going to try to dismantle this center. If something like e4, you'll play something like d6, and it's actually a pretty clean game. Now, it's hard to recommend this for the beginner levels, but I think if you study this opening, it's actually quite useful. Of course, Bobby Fischer does not play this conservatively, instead saying he's going to push the center right away. So switching up the position quite a little bit. And you still see that typical castle. A common defense against this position is just locking down these dark squares so the bishop can't be effective, right? So, okay, we're just going to keep developing. And in this situation, I think many people will be tempted to put the bishop on b7, but what I want you to note is that he wouldn't really be pointing at much, right? So instead, bishop a6, because you're pinning the knight, right? So immediately you're pinning the knight. And finally, we're going to see rook e8 because our opponent wants to pin as well. So we just move over. And I think this really illustrates how to use a successful King's Indian push with e5. These are the types of moves that will actually allow you to control the center again. Now, I did say that you're giving up center control at the start of the game when playing the King's Indian. That is true, but that doesn't mean that you keep control of the center through the entire game. At certain points, you can fight back, and Bobby Fischer picks the perfect moment. So pawn takes, knight takes, and here you already see that these forking pinning ideas are effective. So rook to d1 makes a lot of sense. You might say to yourself, why not take? Well, like I said, there's a forking idea on the board. The knight's defending, and this bishop's really the only thing defending. So you do have to be careful of tactics here, and there are quite a few that might put you in bad position. So adding an extra attacker to this pawn made sense for Robert Byron. He is a grandmaster. He wasn't going to fall for these little tricks. But knight d3. And I think this is the kind of move that really shocks you because you think to yourself, why knight d3? Why do that, right? And really, the reason behind knight d3 isn't even for what you would think because there's nowhere good for the knight to go after. So the whole point is to sacrifice the knight, attacking the rook, king takes, and then knight g4, great move. So a brilliant followed by a great. The whole idea is if the king approaches the knight, we have rook e3, and if the king takes, you'll actually find yourself in a mating net, and it'll be game over very shortly. So you're not going to do that. You're instead going to give up the fork. And Bobby Fischer immediately gets compensation. Now, you might think that you know what Bobby Fischer is doing, but something that you should note is that nobody knew what Bobby Fischer was doing. Literally every Russian grandmaster in the entire, and I'm stuttering right now because it gives me chills. Every Russian grandmaster in the entire world was conspiring to beat Bobby Fischer, and they couldn't figure him out. Nobody knew. And in this situation, he chooses to let the rook survive, and he takes the bishop. Because it turns out, evidently, after king takes, we can push d4. And if you just move the knight out of the way, the pawn goes to d3, and that dark square bishop becomes very, very powerful all of a sudden, and you'll actually end up winning that rook, or at the very least, winning the knight. So knight takes, bishop check. And it's really tricky because the rook is covering the e-file. We have this check. If you go here, you're going to get mated very quickly. So you have to just move backwards. Queen d7. And would you believe it? Robert Byron drops his pen. He shakes Bobby Fischer's hands and he walks away. He is done. He resigns. You would think that Bobby Fischer would be excited, but he was visibly upset as well. And he went on to say that it was one of his biggest disappointments that this game didn't end because in this situation, you cannot play queen g2. And if he was to play the natural queen f2 to defend these threats, we have queen h3 check. And there is no way to defend mate. So for starters, it's basically forced. You have to play king g1. Like I said, the e-file is covered, and you can't defend with the queen because bishop, queen, checkmate. Pretty standard, right? What's not standard was Bobby Fischer's brilliant idea. And if this was played on a board, would have been the most insane idea of all time. Rook e1. Two different ways to take, but it's pick your poison. If queen takes here, guys, queen g2, checkmate, game over. So, okay, no big deal. Just take with the rook. But no. This wasn't just a diversion of the queen. It was a diversion of the rook. Was once defending the knight and no longer. This pins the queen. If queen takes, it's checkmate. And if you ignore the threat and just try to add a defender, queen g2, the queen can't take back because it is pinned and there's nothing else defending. This is just checkmate. Game over. Absolutely masterful. Finally, guys, we have a game by one. Edjanov Pavel, grandmaster, absolute legend. He sees d4. What is he going to do? Well, we already saw then the first example, Botvinnik chooses to play d5 and challenge the center. In the second game, Bobby Fischer chooses to ignore the threat and instead play knight f6, basically saying, I'm going to play a King's Indian. You take the center. I'm going to develop and I'm going to attack you with my dark squared bishop. There are many different ways to get to that win. And for Pavel, he decides to play c5, a dubious looking move called the Old Benoni. The idea is simple. You want to discombobulate the d4 pawn, which proves to be a very strong structural piece. If takes, you will immediately win this pawn back in a multitude of different ways. You might even sacrifice another pawn, and you're going to control the center as black. In a way, it's almost like a reversed Queen's Gambit, but for black. So many people, many top-level players will ignore this threat. And interestingly enough, it almost turns into kind of like a Dutch King's Indian type position. Everybody's kettling. We have this push here. Maybe en passant was possible, but you trade off queens, and as white, you really want to try to take that advantage. He's locking down the dark squares, and quickly, you're going to see this position where black is actually quite strong. There could be a discovery attack where you win this knight, the rook. There are just different ideas here, but I think what's really brilliant about these grandmasters and what really could bring you to the next level is understanding how to use your knights. And I think one of the most important things with knights is knowing where to put them. So these are called outposts. These are spots where your knight can rest, and obviously e3 would take. But the point is, you want to put your knight on an outpost where you can't get taken. The light squared bishop isn't quick to attack, neither is the dark squared bishop. So it turns out that knight e5 is actually a really nice outpost, and our opponent isn't quick to give up the dark squared bishop either, because similar to the King's Indian, our dark squared bishop is very, very strong, right? So the rook's going to defend. Maybe he is prepared to trade here. And of course, knight to d3. Maybe you see knight to f4. He has outposts. I don't think he's too prepared to trade that knight because it's in a really nice spot. But you see, what's super strange is a kingside attack with two kingside kings. And the reason why this is strange is because while you're launching an amazing attack on your opponent, you are also loosening your own defenses, right? So the point is quite simple. You end up here, and we have a fork. And you would think that the knight actually defends this quite well. But you actually can fork a knight, because if the knight does take, which he does, queen takes, check, and this comes with a tempo. The easiest way to define tempo, because people throw the term around a lot and nobody really fully understands it. I think the simplest way to talk about tempo is it's forcing your opponent to make a defensive move. So of course, king to g2 is a defensive move. We have f4, perfect time for our opponent to take back with the bishop. And you would think king takes, queen check, and all of a sudden you force the trade of queens, and this position isn't that bad. Our opponent is up material. So you're fine with consolidating, but the beauty of Pavel's position here is f3, forking the king and the knight. And that's not it. That's not all, because he doesn't choose to take the knight, because of course this rook would be under some serious threats. But bishop f5, he's not looking to checkmate his opponent. He's looking to create a winning endgame. So he trades off queens. He takes the bishop, and he plays bishop h3, and this essentially forces the king to be trapped in a very, very difficult position. The rook has to defend itself, and rook e8. You can't really ignore this threat. Like if you move off of the e file, you're going to have rook e3, and this whole position is going to fall apart. So you take the rook, but you quickly find that now you can't really avoid mate. If the king tries getting closer, rook e1, checkmate, rook comes in, bishop's defending. That's pretty much GG, lock it up, right? And what else do you do? I mean, you have to move the rook back to f1. And when you do that, the bishop takes, and that's just it, game over. So here's the big question. How do you get better from this video? Well, I'll tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't be going and remembering and memorizing these positions. What you should do is understand the ideas of the openings. d5 controls the center, knight f6 ignores the center and allows you to develop quickly, and c5 disrupts your opponent's center. You can play these different openings to do different things, and then you can see the different types of ideas grandmasters go for. This will give you a good litmus test for what kind of attacks you can use in different positions, so that maybe you can do something brilliant too. Stay classy, my friends. Until next time.